Welcome to Revolutionary Optimism. Living at this time in history, we are challenged with the convergence of crises that is affecting our daily lives. Issues like economic hardship, a teetering democracy, and the worsening climate emergency have left many Americans feeling more despair than ever. To respond to the challenging times we're living through, physician, humanitarian, and social justice advocate Dr. Paul Zeitz has identified revolutionary optimism as a new cure for hopelessness, despair, and cynicism. Once you commit yourself as a revolutionary optimist, you can bravely unleash your personal power, #unify with others, and accelerate action for our collective repair, justice, and peace. On this podcast, Dr. Zeitz is working to provide you with perspectives from leaders fighting for equity, justice, and peace, on their strategies, insights, and tools for overcoming adversity and driving forward revolutionary transformation with unbridled optimism and real-world pragmatism. In this episode, Dr. Zeitz is talking with Terry Bouricius. Terry is an internationally known political theorist and thought leader on sortition-based democracy, which uses the random selection of citizens to form genuinely representative deliberative bodies that determine the policies of government. He refers to himself as a, quote, recovering politician. He was elected to the city council in Burlington, Vermont in 1981, in the same election that saw Bernie Sanders elected mayor. Bouricius served on the city council for 10 years, including a term as president, and then for another decade as a member of the Vermont House of Representatives. He was a founder of the Vermont Progressive Party, the only third party in an American state with major party status. After leaving elective office in 2001, he worked with Fair Vote, the Center for Voting and Democracy, as an election reform policy analyst with a particular focus on ranked choice voting. Since 2005, his primary focus has been sortition. In 2015, he organized an international conference on 21st century democracy and sortition, hosted by the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Terry's in the final phase of publishing a new book titled The Trouble with Elections: Everything We Thought We Knew About Democracy is Wrong. Bouricius received his political science BA from Middlebury College in 1976, and he is married with 2 children and lives in Burlington, Vermont. Here's your host, Dr. Paul Zeitz.
I love that you describe yourself as a recovering politician, and I'm really intrigued by your 20 years of service, first in the City Council and then the Vermont House of Representatives. And I wondered if you could share a personal story or two about your experience, about realizations that you may have had about our democracy really not working.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a million stories I could tell. When I was elected first in 1981 with Bernie Sanders, we won election mainly because we worked more than the incumbent. In my city, it was Democrats ran everything. There was maybe one Republican on the city council, and so we were running against the incumbent Democrats. And it's just that we knocked on all the doors, and people were, as today, have a broad disdain for politicians. And so someone saying, I'm not a politician, I'm here to listen to you, was very engaging. And that's what electoral politics is. And we just played it better than the opposition. It's not that people were, I might self-identify as a radical, but that doesn't mean that the people who voted for me were. By the way, we have F-35 fighter jets at our airport, and they're taking off right now. So you might hear some F-35 very loud jets flying overhead while I'm talking. But anyway, an example of campaigning, I remember I knocked on one door and a person said, I recognize you. You're in that doo-wop singing group. You were performing downtown past the hat. Yeah, that was me. And we talked about some good old 1950s rock and roll songs and said, I'll be sure to vote for you. And that was the basis of that person's decision about who to vote for. And I happily accepted the vote. But, it sort of hit home that, this isn't really about policy. It's about skills of interpersonal connection and so on. But when I got to the legislature, the House of Representatives, it became much more evident that the body was not representative of the population. They were there because they were outgoing, ego-driven, self-assured people, a majority men, a majority old, et cetera, And on one of my committees, we were dealing with a landlord-tenant bill, the rights and obligations and responsibilities of landlords and tenants. And I realized that the tenant advocates were not being very carefully listened to. So after all the witnesses had left, I asked all the other members of the committee, like, are any of you renters? And none of us were. I had just bought a house that year. None of us were renters. And so I did an informal poll of the rest of the House. We have 150 House members in Vermont. And I didn't get to everybody, but I got to a huge chunk of them. I only found one renter in the House of Representatives. And a third of the Vermonters are renters. Said, if this body were representative of the population, the nature of the deliberation, what they would hear, because people tend to confirm their own biases. They listen to things that match what they already believe. And so I remember joking that, we could pick 150 people out of a phone book and do better than this. That's when we had phone books. And so I had that inkling, but the House of Representatives, called the People's House, I realized it's not representative of the population.
Yeah. So after 2 decades of serving in public office, you then went into advocacy around reforming our democracy, and you were working with Fair Vote on ranked choice voting. Yeah. What was your journey there? How did that go? And what realizations did you have during that phase of your career?
Well, it's important to realize that I was a third-party elected official, which in the United States is very rare because of our winner-take-all plurality voting system, making third-party candidates often viewed as spoilers, splitting, in my case, the left so that the Republicans could win was the dynamic. And so the solution that I was pushing for with Fair Vote was some sort of ranked choice voting, ideally proportional representation, but at the very least, ranked choice voting so that you wouldn't have the spoiler issue so often.
Can you explain ranked choice voting for my listeners in case they don't fully understand that?
Yeah, the concept is that rather than, let's say there's 3 or 4 candidates on the ballot, you pick one. The risk is if you vote for somebody who doesn't really have a good chance of winning, you may end up effectively helping elect, under the current system, the person you like the absolute least, because they can win with less than half the votes. And so the idea is that having too many choices splits the majority so that a candidate that a large majority of voters agree is the worst candidate can be declared the winner in the system we use in the United States. So with ranked choice voting, instead of just voting for one person, you rank the candidates, your first choice, your second choice, your third choice. So that if nobody gets a majority in the first round, you basically conduct a runoff without having to have voters come back to another election. You just eliminate the candidates that are at the bottom, and you figure out who would those voters' second or third choice be, et cetera. So basically, it's just a runoff election, but all at once. And so that's what I was pushing for reform. And the model what we were using was Australia. They have proportional representation for some offices and this winner-take-all ranked choice voting for other offices. And so that's what we were pushing for. And then I came to find out that election reformers and democracy reformers in Australia were trying to get rid of that because it wasn't satisfying their need for democracy. The reform I was pushing was that the reformers in Australia were trying to go beyond. And that's where I first learned about the concept of sortition, the use of randomly selected bodies of ordinary people, randomly selected, bringing in all the expert testimony, all the witnesses, all the information, and letting them deliberate and make recommendations, and then having ideally another randomly selected jury say yes or no to that proposed law. And that reform I actually experienced while I was pushing ranked choice voting in the United States and Canada and North America. I gave testimony, written testimony, to this citizens' assembly pulled together in British Columbia. It consisted of one man and one woman from each of the legislative districts in the province. And they were looking at, should they reform their voting method? And I was saying, yeah, you should use ranked choice voting. But by the end of that, I said, wait a second. I'm advocating ranked choice voting, but I'm talking to a genuinely representative sample of ordinary people from British Columbia. This is what democracy is. They are democracy. And ever since that inspirational moment, I decided, no, it's not fixing the election system because, quite frankly, it is unfixable. There is no way to reform the voting method to make it democratic. You're always going to have elites, people who have the connections, who have the money, who have the personality, whatever it is. They are special people. They are the aristocracy of our country. And
right. So your journey, you didn't know about sortition while you were serving in the legislature. You then went into advocacy around election reform. You learned about the Australian reforms, and then you participated in a very historic event. It was 20 years ago this year in 2004 in British Columbia, a very ambitious citizens' assembly focusing on electoral reform. Like, was there a moment where you had this like wake up realization?
Yeah,
or was it can you describe that moment? Like what, that's like the kind of moment that changed your life. Like the next 20 years, you completely, it turned your life upside down or turned it right side up.
Yeah, all of the political work I've been doing, building a third party to run, and we finally won some offices and then reformed the voting method so that third parties have a better chance and people can vote for them. That was what I had been working on for decades and decades. And then I saw what democracy actually looks like. And it's not politicians. Politicians are the bane of democracy. And you probably were going to ask me at some point about how we have an undemocratic system in the United States. And it's important to realize that the framers of the US Constitution were not in favor of democracy. They thought democracy was mob rule. They were elites. They were simply opposed to an hereditary aristocracy. They thought that elections would allow the natural aristocracy, the people, regardless of whether they were born into a special family, could rise and become the rulers of the ordinary people. They were all basically aristocrats, all the people at the Constitutional Convention. And Madison and other people said point blank that democracy was dangerous, it was bad, it would threaten the property rights of those who own property, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact that we call it a democracy today is because the word was redefined. I mean, ancient Athens had a form they coined the word democracy to mean a system where ordinary people could propose things, they could establish the agenda, they could vote on things, and there were no politicians in charge. And what most people don't know is that in ancient Athens and in many, many democratic cities throughout Greece, because Athens was just one of dozens or maybe 100 or more democratic cities in Greece in that time, the key thing was not that they had an assembly where people could just go and vote. It was that the control of the agenda and all of the magistrates who administered things were all selected by random lottery.
So can you just give me a context of time? When was this Athenian, and how long did it last, where they were creating this form of authentic democracy, sortition-based democracy? Like when was that, and how long did it last? And it was
around 500 BC, in that vicinity, when the system of sortition, had been used for non-democratic purposes, but the democratic model was around then. And then it was actually reformed. There was a point where Athens lost its democracy for a while. The 30 tyrants were in control, and they overthrew the 30 tyrants and reestablished democracy in Athens around 403 BC. And they established a system where, and most Americans have never heard of this, for the next century in Athens democracy, they said the assembly will meet, and the assembly of any citizen who wanted to participate, they will do things like decide whether we're going to go to war or not, those sorts of big decisions. But all new laws could only be adopted by a randomly selected jury, what's called the nomothetai, and that might be 500, might be 1,000 randomly selected Athenians. They would listen to testimony for and against a proposed new law, and they would vote to adopt the law or not. It was the jury that adopted laws. It was not the assembly, and almost no Americans learn that in school. But that was the fundamental principle of democracy in ancient Athens. Because other city-states like Sparta, they had an assembly, but what was voted on at the assembly was controlled by the elite. Their aristocracy set the agenda and made the proposals. In Athens, randomly selected Council of 500 set the agenda. Any citizen could propose things, and it was a jury that adopted the laws. And quite frankly, I'd say most people who study political science, unless they study ancient Athens, they're unaware of the roots of democracy as well.
Yeah, so I think for our listeners, it'd be helpful to fast forward to our current times. That history is very interesting and very important. You went from Athens to where our founding fathers were also aristocrats and elite, and they were protecting their own interests. So they established an election-based democracy, thinking that would...
See how we automatically use the word election-based democracy? We're so used to that.
Maybe it's not democracy?
Because for 2,000 years, elections were the opposite of democracy. Democracy meant lottery selection. Aristocracy meant the use of elections for 2,000 years, including up through the Renaissance. And it was only after the creation of the United States as a republic, but not a democracy, that the word began to shift. And when finally certain books were written, the word democracy came to mean elections. And today, anybody who uses the word democracy, unless they know about sortition, assumes that it means elections. But that's not what it meant in Athens, and that's not what it meant for 2,000 years. It's only in the last couple hundred years that the word was redefined.
So are there any elements of our current system that are using sortition-based or lottery-based selection that our listeners might be able to relate to?
Well, yeah, the common one people can relate to is the jury model in the United States.
Yeah.
Juries are selected by lottery. Now, it's worth noting that that's not the way the juries started in England in the medieval period. The sheriff would appoint a jury who knew the criminal or the accused person, or knew the people involved with a land dispute, and they was not randomly selected at all. But when the Catholic Church banned trial by not by combat but by ordeal, basically torture, the clergy could no longer participate in that. The juries inherited the job of figuring out guilt and innocence, and it wasn't until in the United States in the 1600s that juries started to be randomly selected. South Carolina was the first place, I believe, in the world where juries started being randomly selected. In other words, they did not inherit it from Athens. It was, convergent evolution. They reinvented the idea of randomly selecting ordinary people to make decisions. And in the United States, in fact, in our Constitution, the right to a jury is in Article 1, Section 9 of our U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to a jury trial. And now, only since the mid-20th century, or is everywhere in the United States using random lottery selection. But even there, it's corrupted by, excusing where the lawyers get to kick people off the randomly selected jury and try and tailor it to bias in the favor of their client and so on. So it's not a good model of lottery selection in the United States, but it's the only place where in the United States we use the concept of a lottery selection.
Yeah. So now we're living in this reality of an election-based system, which you would call an aristocracy-based system rather than a democracy. And most people have limited trust in our politicians. In our Congress, for example, it's at the lowest level in history, where it's like 20% support of our Congress, for example. So I'm wondering, just on a personal level, how do you maintain any optimism about our form of government? And what are you hopeless or are you optimistic? And when you are hopeless, how do you regenerate yourself into optimism? How does that operate within you as a person?
Well, I guess the basic idea is that we can't know what the prospects are. We can only, like, there's a big boulder and we just put our shoulder to it and push. We hope other people are joining us. And we don't know if it's suddenly going to start moving or not. It's not the exact same thing as optimism, but it's a lack of cynicism. It's a willingness to try. I mean, I guess I would point to the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square in Egypt and in things that happened throughout that part of Northern Africa. Nobody, none of the spy agencies in the United States, nobody thought that suddenly there was going to be this wave of overthrowing of despots, and there was going to be what they thought was a democratic wave. And suddenly it happened. So you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen. Now, I like to imagine, what if the people in Tahrir Square all had heard of the idea of lottery selection, of jury model, of sortition for creating a genuine democracy? Because they had never heard of it, right? So the only thing they can imagine is getting rid of their authoritarian president and having a new election. That's the only solution that could occur to you if you've never heard of anything. It's either tyrants or elections. Those are the only two possibilities. But there is another possibility. So I like to imagine what would happen if at that point millions of people had already heard of sortition, had already seen examples of, maybe at their college or in their co-op or some other organization, their union had used a lottery process to form a body that's selected the executive committee, et cetera, that it could happen very, very quickly. So I'm not saying it's going to. I'm not optimistic in the sense of blind optimism, but there is reason for hope.
Okay, great. So you draw on historical possibilities as your inspiration. You see that if this approach to an authentic democracy, if we can gain traction on it, sortition-based democracy, I want to dig in on it a little bit more. I really want my listeners to really get your theory and your vision here. And you have this book, which I want to bring to the audience's attention. It's called The Trouble with Elections: Everything We Thought We Knew About Democracy is Wrong. And you can search for that on Substack right now. It's in the process of being reviewed, but the whole book is there, the current version of the book.
Yeah, there's not a paper version. You can't find it on Amazon or something.
Yeah,
right?
It's not yet on Amazon. It will be hopefully someday soon. But can you give us an overview of the book, the thesis of the book? And I know you talk about the psychology of elections, and I think this would be a good time to dig into. It's been hard for my own mind to get my head around the idea that everything that I have been taught about my own system of government is completely wrong. In fact, I even went and voted yesterday.
Well, I'm going to vote too. I mean, when you're in a system, you don't ignore the opportunities that you have. Yeah. You just want to change it.
Okay, so you're saying we have to still participate in the system that we have right now while we're envisioning a whole new system. Yeah. So give us a sense of the book and any aspect of it that you think really fits. And then I really want to shift, after we do that part, into what's happening right now today in the United States.
Yeah. Well, first, before I even talk about the book, people have to understand this is not pie in the sky dreaming by people like me. There have been over 600 randomly selected citizens' assemblies convened all over the world on 5 different continents, throughout Europe and Asia and South America and Africa. In other words, it's a system of reform that is well known around the world and is being implemented. It's just that in the United States, we're lagging way behind, and very few people in the United States have heard of it. But in places like Canada and throughout Europe, I mean, there, as I say, over 600 citizens' assemblies have been convened, and they've been institutionalized in some places. Paris, the city of Paris, has a permanent citizens' assembly where people rotate in, and they can produce laws for the city council. In Belgium, there's province of Belgium that has a permanent system of randomly selected bodies that can propose changes. In Australia, the budgets have been established by randomly selected juries. I mean, in Mongolia, believe it or not, any constitutional amendment for the country of Mongolia has to first be approved by a randomly selected, I think it's like 600 people, jury has to review any constitutional amendments. So it's not pie in the sky. It's real. It's happening. Well, now, in terms of what I'm talking about, why elections cannot be fixed is that it is an oligarchic system. It selects people who have something special about them. They're maybe delegated, maybe they're very bright, or they have access to a lot of money, or they have the right personality, or whatever. But they're not like ordinary people. In fact, most of them are egomaniacal. I mean, I would put myself, I was a politician, I was very self-confident. I'm still very self-confident. And it's a room full of people who already think they've got the world figured out. They are basically unable to deliberate. They cannot absorb new information that contradicts with what they've already concluded. So you have a room full of people and they can't deliberate. They have no interest in deliberating. What passes for that debate is merely performance. It's performance art for the next election. And they say, well, I have to get reelected if I want to do the good work. But they never get around to doing the good work because they're always working on their next election. And of course, voters have no idea what their elected officials are doing because most of the important work is done behind closed doors. The deals that are struck, it's not the roll call votes. Those are the tail, very end of the process. It's the deals that are cut behind closed doors that no voters have any clue about. Maybe some lobbyists do because they're often in those rooms with the legislators, but ordinary voters never know that. And so, you know, you have a bunch of people, they're mostly, like in Congress, in the US Congress, a large majority of them are millionaires. You know, 2/3 of the senators are millionaires. They're mostly old, white, rich men. Not all of them. There are excellent people in the mix. There are some people there who are the salt of the earth, the best working class heroes imaginable. But the group as a whole is not competent to make decisions for the population. And quite frankly, that's one of the things when you first raised the idea of randomly selected jury making policy, people say, well, but don't they have to have expertise? I mean, they need to know about lawmaking. The lawmakers who are elected don't have any expertise. It's their staff that do all of that. They are only experts at public relations and gathering power. That's what their expertise is. It's not in lawmaking. They're not competent because they're unable to deliberate and absorb new information. So ordinary people, based on the actual experience of citizens' assemblies all over the world, are more capable of taking in new information, deliberating, finding win-win options, which politicians hate. Politicians don't want win-win solutions. They want solutions where they can show that their opposition are evil, foolish, bad people. It's all about trying to vilify the opposition. It's not about trying to solve problems.
Yeah. That is a real harsh and maybe true analysis of our current reality. And, that may be explaining why people are so frustrated with the state of our quote unquote democracy and our frustration at our political leaders.
And it is around the world. I mean, the United States in particular, but when pollsters ask, how do you feel about democracy? They're asking about how do you feel about elections and politicians? And it's been going down and down. People's approval of it has been going down and down. But it's not that they disapprove of people having control over their lives and their government. They don't like the politicians that elections put in power. So when they say, we're having a crisis of democracy, no, we're having a crisis of elections. People hate politicians. Not all politicians. There are excellent people in the mix. I mean, I like Bernie Sanders. He's a personal friend of mine. But as a group, as a system, if the only alternative that people can imagine is a strong man, a tyrant, because they hate the politicians, they're willing to try something else. Ideally, they would have heard of sortition and say, instead of a strong man, a dictator, maybe we could let ordinary citizens get the information, get the experts, hear the witnesses, and make decisions in the interests of the community as a whole, instead of either politicians or tyrants.
Yeah, when I was writing my book, Revolutionary Optimism, one of the things that I learned about was the fear of freedom. Like people would have to have the responsibility and the freedom to be learning and deliberating and building a consensus on laws. And most people don't want to take that on. They'd rather defer that to someone else that they've elected. So I think there's like a psychological shift that would need to occur to for regular people who are very busy with their own lives. They're busy in survival mode, trying to feed their kids, trying to pay the bills, trying to keep their housing. They don't think that they have the capability or the responsibility. Like, how would that work? How would it work that, okay, all of a sudden I get selected and I'm going to I can imagine many people going, this is crazy. These people, I defer to them, you know?
Yes, but here's the thing. That's why voting in elections doesn't work, because almost none of the voters are well informed. It's called rational ignorance. If you have one vote out of millions, your one vote isn't going to turn the election one way or the other, because it would have to be a tie election and your vote makes a difference. So the fact is that it's not reasonable to spend the time digging into policy and digging into all these issues because your vote is so small. But in a jury, and this has been shown, when people are put on a jury, like in a court, they take it very seriously. They learn, they pay attention. They're paid, maybe not enough. We would like to pay them more. But the point is, when you take a sample of people and say, for the next 3 months or whatever the term is, you're going to decide the tax rate for billionaires. You're in charge of it. They take that very seriously. In other words, and that's what the Citizens Assembly has shown, that ordinary people, when given a task that's going to be meaningful and it's for a defined length of time, they get paid, childcare is taken care of, et cetera, ordinary people actually do better than politicians. And it's not that each individual member of the jury is competent. You don't care if each individual member, you care about whether the jury as a whole is competent. And quite frankly, you can having some people on the jury of all different incomes, all different education levels, all different races, makes the jury as a whole more competent, because that diversity, there's information that's spread throughout society that if you have a bunch of white, rich men in a room, there's things that they just have no clue about. They just don't know about that. They don't know about the problem of making a rent payment at the end, at the beginning of the month, et cetera, et cetera. So the actual experience of juries in the United States and of citizens' assemblies, 600 of them, more than 600, shows that ordinary people do indeed take it seriously, do indeed learn the information, do indeed make good deliberative bodies. And so, yeah, nobody wants to do it, but it's a civic responsibility. People complain about jury duty, but when they're on a jury, they do a good job.
Yeah, and I've read some studies showing that 80% of people that have participated in jury duty, for example, have a very positive experience. They feel great about contributing to the common good, and also they've learned, and they end up building strong relationships with the people that they're sitting with. Yeah. So let me ask you: have you ever talked to Bernie Sanders about sortition-based democracy? What does he say?
I was at a party at his house last summer, and I was talking with somebody else. Bernie was across the table from me, and I was talking to another person about sortition. So I've talked about it in front of him, but I haven't talked to him exactly, because here's the thing. Bernie, it's not like he subscribes to the great man of history theory, but everything in his life has shown, it happens to have worked out that he has gone on in these wonderful ways and done all this great thing, that I'm anxious about whether somebody who has had as much success as he has would latch onto the idea, because everything in his life has said the path that he pursued is the winning path, So, but I have not had that talk. I may at some point, but I have not yet.
Okay, well, I want to encourage you to do that. I'd be really curious about it. I mean, and then, let's kind of bridge now into like our current state of our US political system. I won't call it a democracy anymore. Um, it's hyper polarized. The country's split right now. We're on the cusp of a presidential election. It may be a contested election, but whatever happens, we're polarized. How does this idea of sortition-based or lottery-selected citizens create in a body, in a citizens' assembly, creating laws and running our government, basically? Would that play in your mind with conservatives, for libertarians, for progressives? Like, give us your analysis of the political sensibilities across the political spectrum.
Well, first off, we have to understand the polarization in the United States. I would argue that it is primarily fanned, exacerbated, created, and generated by politicians. Because the way to mobilize people to come out and vote is fear. And both the Democrats and Republicans, I mean, they're not idiots. They want to get votes. And all the psychologists say fear is the best motivator to get people to do things. Now, I'm not saying don't vote or anything like that. No, I'm not saying that. It's the game in town. You play the game because that's the only way you can have any hope at all right now. But a lot of the polarization are on issues that are manufactured for the purpose of campaigning. I don't remember, a couple of years ago, big hullabaloo about whether there should be bathrooms that have no gender reference. That was an issue created for the purpose of mobilizing and causing worry by certain people, etc. There's the wall on the border. There's a whole list of issues where they are created for the purpose of mobilizing voters because we have elections. Now, if we didn't have elections and we had randomly selected people, the experience has been that in all the citizens' assemblies that have been conducted, people of very different points of view find that, we both like to play bridge. We both collect salt shakers or whatever. They find commonality, and the polarization sort of evaporates. Now, there are real differences in society, so there will be still conflicts, but most of the conflicts that we experience in the United States are fake. In other words, they are not that there aren't real conflicts, but they are manufactured by the politicians for electoral imperatives, not because they're fundamental issues for the society.
Now, so a good example of that is abortion rights, and that was an issue that was intentionally politicized by Lee Atwater back in the Reagan era, and it created this polarization: Roe versus Wade versus anti-abortion, and that's playing out right now in our current election cycle. Can you share the example of the Ireland Citizens Assembly, which is a predominantly Catholic country, and how that led to constitutional reform there, where you might have thought it would have been hyper-polarized, but I think it's an interesting example that I want my listeners to learn
Most
about.
Americans who read the news, they may have heard that in Ireland, they recently amended their constitution, two different amendments, different years, to legalize same-sex marriage and to legalize abortion. And what most Americans have never heard is that both of those were initiated by randomly selected constitutional conventions, that the politicians were more observers than participants. And these randomly selected bodies were created because the politicians in a Catholic country, they were afraid of those issues. They didn't want to take a stand. So they said, you citizens, you randomly selected body, you figure it out. And they did. They came together. And there's some really wonderful stories that came out. One, on the one on gay marriage, there's this wonderful report I read of this person who had been staunchly against gay marriage, went to the assembly. One of the people who he became good friends with at the assembly, another member, was a gay man. And they became close friends. And it turned out that this person who was staunchly against gay marriage had been abused by a gay man when he was a child. He had this idea that gay people were basically evil. And he met this person who wanted to get married, and it was a friend of his. And his whole analysis of what this was about morphed. And they wrote this together. They wrote this wonderful narrative of their experience on this assembly. So what happened is the assembly overwhelmingly, in both of these issues, said these changes should go into the Constitution. And then they were overwhelmingly ratified in a constitutional vote, a referendum. So the politicians were mostly at an arm's length of both of these issues. And there was controversy. The Catholic Church still opposed them both. And in a Catholic country, most of the citizens said, yeah, but we're going to make this change. So not to say that things like abortion are not genuine issues, deeply held beliefs by people on both sides, that difference does exist. But in a democracy, you don't want to go to war about it. You want to talk. You want to find common ground. If you can. If you can't, then the majority will decide. And that's what happened in Ireland.
So imagine our future United States, and we had a fourth branch of government, a citizens' assembly here in the United States. Then I've heard from people on the progressive side being afraid that citizens' assembly would include the MAGA radicals or the anti-science people. So how do you deliberate with people that don't believe in facts?
Well, the experience of the citizens' assemblies all over the world have shown people come together. They have a whole education phase where various pieces of information are presented. They can ask for additional witnesses. The point is, a lot of those people are following the lead of politicians who are intentionally misinforming them. Politicians have an incentive to tailor their information and people tend to say, well, I believe my politician over here, I don't care what you say. But if you take people out of that milieu, you put them in a different environment, it's a jury model, and they're talking to each other and they're deliberating and they bring in witnesses, and the witnesses say over and over again, this is not true, this is true. And people can learn and can become better at understanding reality than politicians want them to be.
Right. And we also have to recognize that if I'm an advocate, right? So I'm trying to figure out, I have a point of view about certain issues that I'm advocating for at times. But when you put issues like the climate emergency, for example, into a sortition-based body, it may not come out with the solutions that I personally would think are the best ones. You kind of have to give up that that you're right, and that there may be a win-win consensus-based solutions that could emerge from deliberative democracy that might be surprising to both sides.
Yeah, I want to give an example of why the issues that people get excited about, the partisan issues, are not often fundamental. For example, the Republican Party for generations had been pro-free trade. Trump comes into office, says, nope, we're going to do tariffs. And almost without a peep, the Republican Party threw away generations of foundational arguments and said, nope, okay, yeah, we'll go with our leader. But the Democrats have done the same thing. Obama was a staunch supporter of single-payer universal health care. He got into presidency. He decided he didn't have the votes to pass that, so he was going to push what was called Romney Care. It was a Republican initiative. We went in Massachusetts where it was a market-based thing where they would provide some subsidies, and it became known as Obamacare. And the Democrats all went, yes, we want this. This is great. And they abandoned universal health care, single payer as the Canadian model. And so both parties readily follow their leaders and will abandon what should be and appear to be fundamental principles and issues. So it's not unique to Republicans. It's not unique to Democrats. It's unique to an electoral system with politicians.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you envision like a transition from our election-based corporatocracy, I'll call it, to a sortition-based democracy? Like, how could that happen? I mean, do you envision some kind of transition where there would be electeds and selecteds at the same time, or
Yeah.
could there be a revolutionary transformation to a completely sortition-based democracy?
Well, I think it's probably going to be a slow transition. However, things suddenly accelerate at times in history in an unpredictable way. I am not in favor of trying to mix elected people and randomly selected people in the same body. You have two different classes of people. That wouldn't work. I also I'm kind of not in favor of the idea of having that the Senate selected by lottery and the House selected by elections and having them butt heads. I'm afraid that the politicians who have a career path, who are expert public relations people, if elected body is then butting heads with a sortition body of amateurs who don't have a career at stake, the expert public relations people will be able to basically delegitimize and attack and basically crush this sortition body. So my solution is still transitional, it's still gradual process, but I would prefer a strategy of pulling away one policy domain at a time from the elected officials and then putting that thoroughly in the hands of a jury model. So let's say if you're in a city, you could say, let's take zoning away from the city council. Zoning is now going to be decided by juries. Or we're going to take away setting the property tax rate. That's going to be done by juries, not by the city council. Or we're going to take away some ordinance writing authorities from the city council, give it to a jury. On the national level, you could say climate change. We're not going to let the politicians do that. It's too important because they can only look as far as the next election cycle. They can't look a generation down the road. Elections don't allow them to have that long-term view. Or maybe something like transportation or the tax rate. Let's say income tax rates are established by jury instead of politicians. So I want the term I use is peeling away. I want to peel away one policy domain at a time from the electeds and empower a sortition body to make those decisions, final decisions, not a recommendation to the politicians. That's basically what we've been doing up to this point around the world. Is most of the sortition bodies have not been making final decisions. They've been making policy decisions that then get sent to the decision makers.
Well, sometimes the forcing mechanism can be a referendum, like in the Irish.
In the Irish example, and in British Columbia, they did that in 2004. The politicians who set up the system, I give them so much credit. They set up a randomly selected one man, one woman from each district. They met for I think 10 months.
10 months
on weekends and so on, made a recommendation that went directly to referendum, and the politicians had nothing to say about it. And it got 58% approval in the referendum. But the politicians had put in a proviso that it needed to get 60% to go into effect. But less than 60% of the voters had voted for those politicians. So the referendum actually got a higher percentage of vote than the winning members of parliament. But anyway.
So to your point that they could undermine the legitimacy. That was a big setback for the whole deliberative movement because, yeah. But there is a really good model that I think resonates with what you're saying about appealing approach. The state of Michigan has a gerrymandering commission that is randomly selected citizens that are determining redistricting based on the consensus. Isn't that a good example of how?
Places where the politicians have a clear conflict of interest are a good place to start. For example, ethics enforcement in Congress. Rather than having an ethics committee of other House members, that should go to a jury of randomly selected citizens so that you don't have one party covering for a member of their party who is clearly corrupt, etc. That's a place. The gerrymandering thing, that's another place where it's obvious. But quite frankly, I want to get into things that have nothing to do with the politicians at all. I want to get into policy domains, things like, let's say, transportation is now going to be managed by randomly selected juries that rotate, new people come in, and politicians have nothing to do with it. The example I like to say, it's like the the royalty of Europe. There still are kings and queens, but they don't have much political power. It might be, my hope is that a generation from now, we might still have a Congress, but all they're doing is naming post offices and
and the power would shift to citizens' bodies. Yeah. That's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary vision, and I really appreciate it. Last question today is we're living in a time where there could be a political flashpoint. There could be a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
There could be a eruption of political violence, is what many people are fearing right now. How do you think advocacy for a sortition-based democracy can? It was almost like your Egypt example, Tahrir Square. Like if those people would have known about that, what happens if we see a groundswell of popular discontent with a authoritarian government or a fascist government? How could a sortition-based democracy emerge from that kind of crisis?
Well, the challenge we have is that so few Americans have even heard of the concept. And so it's hard to imagine this crisis that could well, as people who are listening to this, and we're recording it ahead of time, people who are listening to it may say, oh yeah, there's a crisis. It may not be able to grab this opportunity, but the point is our Constitution with its electoral college and all kinds of aspects of it is a crisis generator. And there are going to be crises, and maybe the solution is a constitutional convention. And ideally, if we could push to say we want no politicians at the convention, so we're going to each state pledges to select randomly selected people to go to this constitutional convention. That would be something.
Yeah, and there are precedents for that. Iceland and Ireland, I think, used citizens' assemblies as part of their renewal of their constitution.
Yeah, they both used randomly selected bodies. Now, the thing is, in Europe, sortition is widely known. Anybody who reads the newspaper regularly in places like France, they're very well aware of it because there was a national citizens' assembly on climate change that was in the news constantly. Macron, the president, was saying, yes, this is very important. I'm planning to go forward with these things. So like anyone who's well-read in Europe or Australia or many places in Asia knows all about sortition. It's only in the United States that nobody has heard of it yet.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being on the program today and bringing my United States listeners up to speed on this opportunity. And we are working really hard to get the word out about the opportunity of sortition-based democracy. And your leadership, your clarity, and your perspective is so appreciated. So thank you so much for being on the program today.
Well, thanks very much.
Wow, folks, that was an amazing episode with political theorist Terry Bouricius, who is a pioneer in championing sortition-based or lottery-based democracy, where citizens get selected to bring forward policies, laws, and to oversee our government. Can you imagine what it would be like if we had that kind of government operating now in the United States, where we got rid of the politicians who are designed to polarize us and separate us? Wow, this kind of reform is ripe for explosion and expansion here in the United States. Terry calls himself a recovering politician after 20 years of serving in the city council and the state legislature. And then he became a reformer, and he was first working on election reforms, but then he, over the last 20 years, has become a leading expert on sortition-based democracy. And he's optimistic. He is a fountain of enthusiasm for this very transformational idea. So without a doubt, I would call Terry Bouricius a revolutionary optimist. He doesn't necessarily think that everything's going to happen overnight, but he's open to that possibility. And he's ready to roll as soon as we are, the people, the citizens of the United States, to take on our rightful responsibility to be the ones who run our government and determine our policies, rather than these elected officials who have only self-interest in mind, for the most part. So I'm so grateful that Terry could join our show, and thank you for this opportunity.
Are you ready to be part of the revolution? To learn more about revolutionary optimism, please visit revolutionaryoptimism.com. To get to know Dr. Zeitz, please visit drpaulzeitz.org. And to explore building movements, please visit unifymovements.org. If you like this show, be sure to follow on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Revolutionary Optimism, transforming the world one episode at a time.